And we are live. Hello, everybody. This morning we had another marathon round of oral arguments. It was kind of the length of the tariffs oral arguments, but this time it was with the Trump v. Slaughter case, the case that will likely send the nearly century-old precedent of Humphrey's executor out to slaughter, if you forgive the overused play on words with that. Here with us to discuss that is Supreme Court scholar Leah Litman, who is my go-to with stuff like this. She always identifies the crux of the story. And just to put the bottom line up front, Leah, it just seems here perfectly clear that this is one 90-year-old precedent that is going out the door, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, frankly, that was clear before the oral argument. Oral argument just sealed the deal. And the only question is what they are actually going to say in this opinion when they write the line Humphrey's executor is overruled or no longer applicable.
And to that point, before we actually get into where they draw that line, because I think that was the crux of the nearly 3 hours of oral arguments, the if you can give folks some background that what happened 90 years ago in when the Supreme Court essentially created the birth of formalized, although we've had informal independent agencies up to the founding of the United States. What happened with Humphrey's executor 90 years ago, and how has a concept of independent agencies developed since then?
Yeah, so Humphrey's executor actually arose during the administration of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And what happened is there was a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission who had been appointed by the previous administration, Herbert Hoover, and FDR wanted him out because he didn't want holdover from the Hoover administration to kind of interfere with his vision for the FTC and the economy. So he fires Humphreys, and then there is this lawsuit about whether Humphreys was legally fired because a congressional statute had indicated that the president could only remove commissioners of the Federal Trade Commission for what's known as cause, basically inefficiency, neglect of duty, malfeasance. And the president couldn't remove them at will. And specifically couldn't remove them because the president had a different political vision, a different policy agenda, than the commissioner themselves did. So the case went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that that statute limiting the president's authority to remove commissioners of the FTC was perfectly constitutional. And so that kind of cemented the foundation of independent agencies that have a degree of independence from the president and that they aren't subject to the kind of political control that allows the president to basically dictate, what the agency head is going to pursue. And so for a century, Humphrey's executor and all of the cases affirming Humphrey's executor and applying it have, again, led us to this place where there are pockets of independence within the administrative state from presidential control, at least until now. Donald Trump gets into office. He begins firing, members of multi-member commissions in violation of federal law, including one member of the FTC, Rebecca Slaughter. And so this case, again, perfectly tees up the future of Humphrey's executor because the president has fired a member of the FTC, which is the very same agency where the Supreme Court upheld a law that limited the president's authority to remove those commissioners.
And that's why folks going into today's oral arguments expected that Humphrey's executor would be on the chopping block. Can you talk about the emergency docket ruling we got earlier this year that allowed Trump to continue ousting Rebecca Slaughter, the FTC commissioner, despite the fact that as we speak, Humphreys is still good law?
Yeah, so I think we should go first back a little earlier to this past spring when the president fired members of the National Labor Relations Board as well as the Merit Service Protection Board. And those are multi-member commissions similar to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, whose members are insulated from presidential removal. And President Trump fired them. Lower courts said you can't do that. The government went up to the Supreme Court on the shadow docket. The Supreme Court stayed those opinions and wrote an opinion in Trump versus Wilcox saying, basically everyone who exercises significant executive power has to be removable by the president. And the court didn't mention their previous decision in Humphrey's executor. So that was a very strong signal that the court was unwilling to kind of stick with Humphreys in the long term. And so President Trump took the next step. He fired a commissioner of the FTC, again, the very same agency that was at issue in Humphrey's executor. Lower courts once again say, look, even though the Supreme Court is allowing the president to fire the heads of other multi-member commissions, he still can't fire the head of the FTC, given again that the Supreme Court upheld the statute that said presidents don't have to have plenary authority to fire members of the FTC. On the shadow docket, the Supreme Court says we are going to allow the president to remove Rebecca Slaughter from her post on the FTC while this litigation remains pending. And we are going to schedule this case for oral argument before the Court of Appeals even weighs in. So they granted what's called certiorari before judgment, basically hearing the case on an expedited schedule, and specifically about whether to overrule their previous decision in Humphrey's executor. So all of that was pretty clear evidence that they were going to do the deed and just pull the trigger and overrule Humphrey's executor, as we were talking about.
I'm going to read a couple of the quotes that we heard today over the course of the oral arguments. You had Justice Sotomayor saying to John Sauer, who was Trump's former personal attorney turned Solicitor General, quote, "You are asking us to destroy the structure of government. You end up with massive unchecked power in the hands of the president." Is it that grim?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like we should look at, I think, some comments that Rebecca Slaughter made soon after she was removed from her post. And what she said is, look, if you observed the president's inauguration, you would have seen him surrounded by the heads of various companies and corporations. It turns out that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, had cases against or business with all of those entities. Right. And part of why you want an independent commission is so the commission isn't headed by someone subject to presidential control when the president seems pretty interested, in getting these companies to kind of bend the knee and, is willing to scratch their back if they do so. And so the independence of agencies has really been the mechanism to ensure that other voices are heard within the government, even when, the president is a Republican or the president is a Democrat. Right? When the president is a Democrat, there are still, Republican commissioners on the Federal Trade Commission who might have more of a pro-business orientation. When the president is Republican, there are still Democratic commissioners on the FTC who have a more pro-consumer outlook. And so independence was a way of bringing more representation, diversity, and frankly, democracy to these independent agencies and making sure they weren't subject to political whim. And I guess if you were wondering, well, why else might we be concerned about presidential control? Look no further than the Federal Reserve Board, right? There's a reason why the Supreme Court is unwilling thus far to say the president has plenary authority to fire members of the Federal Reserve Board, because that would plunge the economy into chaos. You don't want interest rates. You don't want monetary policy to be set with an eye toward what's politically convenient for me, rather than what is in the long-term economic interests of the country. And it's those sorts of functions that agency independence have been able to serve.
And to that point, there's this quote by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, quote, "Independent agencies exist because Congress has deemed some issues should be handled by nonpartisan experts. Having a president come in and fire all the doctors and scientists and replace them with loyalists is not in the interests of the American people." Right now on the front page, the web page of the New York Times, I have to say they really hit the nail on the head with it, right? In laying out the stakes, there are three separate articles about this Trump v. Slaughter arguments. And one of those articles talks about how sweeping potentially the independent agencies are at issue here. You talked about the Federal Reserve, and let's get to that a little bit later. But there are other agencies that are structured similarly. The NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, Securities and Exchange Commission. And this is a key line from one of the three articles on the New York Times website right now. An amicus brief lists 50 boards and commissions that could be affected by the decision. What can be affected?
So many agencies, again, every agency that we have conceived of up until this point as independent, all of the agencies you rattled off, the National Labor Relations Board, the agency that is in charge of enforcing federal labor laws in this country. The Merit Service Protection Board, that is the agency that is in charge of protecting the civil service, i.e., if Donald Trump, right, or his lackeys try to fire like those civil servants who are supposed to be nonpartisan, the Merit Systems Protection Board, that's supposed to be the agency that will enforce those laws. The Consumer Product Safety Commission that, protects consumers, the Federal Election Commission, the Federal Communications Commission. I could go on. Like these are some of the agencies that regulate, so many aspects of our lives. Justice Kagan has described agencies as really the modern face of the federal government as we know it, because so much of, what happens today in government is done through these agencies. And this decision is basically poised to hand the president near plenary authority over who runs those agencies and therefore how they will be run.
And as one commentator pointed out, the Merit Systems Protection Board has already been purged to
Yep.
some extent by the Trump administration, and it's part of this suite of cases that the court is considering. There's another one that I wasn't even aware of, again, is part of this same New York Times coverage, 3 articles laying out the stakes of today's hearings. They talk about the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation apparently meant that its agency gets little notice outside the shipping and maritime industries, but it maintains a key North American trade route that $26 billion a year in cargo traverses. That would seemingly potentially be affected by
Yeah.
this ruling.
Yeah.
So where the one thing that I watched nearly, the entire nearly 3-hour hearing, and one theme that kept going again and again is line drawing. And
Yeah.
if the court accepts that any intrusion on the president's authority is unacceptable under the Constitution, you cannot create an agency that is protected. I think was referred to at one time as a headless fourth branch. If that is the case, where is the line drawn? And did John Sauer actually ever answer that question?
We don't know where the line is drawn, in part because John Sauer and, frankly, the Republican appointees were utterly unwilling to give any indication about where they think the line could, would, or should be drawn. Basically, what's going to happen is the Supreme Court is going to replace what is existing law, which says, again, these multi member commissions, Congress can say those multi member commissioners need not be subject to presidential removal. And they're going to replace that with a test that says, well, anyone who is exercising significant executive power, they need to be subject to presidential control. And so we don't know, who the court will say is exercising significant executive control. At a minimum, that's going to be the heads of these, previously independent agencies, maybe except for the Federal Reserve Board. John Sauer indicated it could also include people who are classified as inferior officers, basically people who aren't the heads of these agencies, but are kind of like a step below them. He refused to commit on whether that would extend to people who are classified as employees of the federal government. That would include basically any member of the civil service. Justice Sotomayor said, well, what about the tax court? What about these ostensibly adjudicative bodies, that are staffed by people who aren't removable at will by the president, like the Court of Federal Claims? And there too, John Sauer was unwilling to take a position, so much so that both Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan, and Justice Jackson, all kind of mocked him for being unwilling to do so. You and I had an exchange where Justice Sotomayor, we remarked about this exchange. Justice Sotomayor said, well, what about the tax court? And all John Sauer, the Solicitor General, would say is, well, we haven't challenged that. And Justice Sotomayor immediately retorted, not yet. But of course, like
Right.
once the court makes this ruling and changes the law, it will be inviting these challenges, right?
Right.
Because it will have to establish the limits on who exercises significant executive power and therefore must be subject to presidential control.
Absolutely. And as I recall, Justice Sotomayor repeated those words, not yet. It was this sort
Yeah,
of ominous thing that was just hovering over the proceedings because
yeah,
she was basically saying, you open up these floodgates, we're going to be dealing with this later on. By the way, the title of that article that I was reading from on the New York Times, Plain Trade and Nuclear Energy. Supreme Court weighs the fate of independent regulators. So the nuclear energy came up in this. If there's a plain investigation, I
yep.
don't see why Trump cannot fire one of the board members investigating the cause of a plane incident.
Exactly. Yeah, it's pretty terrifying, especially when you think about some of the narratives, that his administration, right, have attempted to really like propagate about some of the plane accidents, right? They attempted to blame plane accidents on having like a female pilot, right? Are they really going to fire any member of this, national transportation board who is unwilling to say that? That's really terrifying when you think again about so many facets of our lives that are governed by what these agencies do and say.
Right. And one of the things that came up during today's oral arguments, and that's part of that article that I keep praising here, is that the tradition of independent agencies is since our founding, that there was the creation of a commission that would repay Revolutionary War debts, and that from the beginning there was an idea that it doesn't all have to be wound up in politics. And the other part of this suite of articles that I found so eye opening about the existing FTC chairman being tilted to Trump. At he refers to it. Our existing FTC chairman now refers to it as the Trump Vance FTC.
Yeah.
Is this what we're left with?
Yes, I mean, that is what we are going to be left with. He has fired the Democratic commissioners, on the FTC, on the NLRB, on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, basically on every agency where there used to be Democratic commissioners. And that has, repurposed these agencies into partisan arms rather than independent arms, that were tasked with independently, principally, neutrally enforcing federal law based on their expertise.
Mm. And it does seem to, I think, a point that you made earlier that the court is inclined to think of the Federal Reserve differently. How are they going to draw that line? And let's say they honor the independence of the Federal Reserve. Do they necessarily rule in favor of Lisa Cook, or do they say any sort of excuse that Trump comes up with to oust a Federal Reserve board member is something that we cannot question?
Yeah, so I think it was clear from the oral argument that they are inclined to continue saying that the Federal Reserve Board is different. This is something that they said in their initial opinion, last spring, Trump versus Wilcox, where they said the president could fire, the commissioners of the National Labor Relations Board. The Supreme Court said, some people said if the president had to be able to do this, then the president would also necessarily have the power to fire governors of the Federal Reserve. We don't think that's true, right? The Federal Reserve is a unique entity. It's quasi-private with a distinct historical tradition. They just kind of made up some words that suggested the Federal Reserve Board was unique. And today, during the oral argument, Justice Kavanaugh basically asked John Sauer, the lawyer for the federal government, the Fed is different, isn't it? And Sauer said, yeah, kind of based on what you said. And so it seemed like they are inclined just to kind of reiterate, what they said, which is, again, that the Constitution doesn't require the president to have the authority to fire governors of the Federal Reserve, even if the Constitution requires the president to have the authority to fire heads of every other agency. But as you indicated, this doesn't necessarily mean the court is going to police, very meaningfully the limits that Congress has created on the president's authority to remove governors of the Federal Reserve because the president, purported to remove Lisa Cook, a governor of the Federal Reserve, not by saying, he can remove governors of the Federal Reserve in violation of federal law, but he said he was complying with federal law, which again only allows the president to remove governors of the Fed, for what's called cause, for reasons of inefficiency, malfeasance, neglect of duty. And the president said he had that based on these frankly spurious allegations of mortgage fraud, that would have arisen before Lisa Cook ever became governor of the Federal Reserve. So it's possible that even if the Supreme Court says it is constitutional for Congress to limit the president's authority to remove, governors of the Federal Reserve, that they would say the president here actually had authority under the statute to remove Cook, for this reason. I'm not sure we really have an indication one way or another. On one hand, they have allowed Cook to continue serving as a governor of the Federal Reserve in the interim. That has not, however, always been indicative of how the court will rule on these shadow docket applications that they shift to oral argument, for the regular docket. For example, on the birthright citizenship matters from last term, the Supreme Court didn't rule immediately on the federal government's request for a stay in the birthright case, instead scheduling it for oral argument. But of course, we all know that when push came to shove and the court issued its opinion, they ruled for the federal government in significant respects. And so it's very possible that the Supreme Court is going to say courts just aren't really able to police meaningfully that the president has complied with the statutory limitations on the president's ability to remove governors of the Federal Reserve.
And of course, in this case, they did allow Trump to oust Commissioner Slaughter before oral argument. So, as you noted, it just remains to be seen. There was interesting timing because this morning, ProPublica came out with a bombshell story saying that under Trump's standard of what mortgage fraud is, Trump has that same paperwork where one of his mortgages has it is listed as this personal residence. It's the same sort of thing that him and Bill Pulte are all about. And ProPublica says, not only do you have your cabinet members, which was another ProPublica investigation or a Reuters investigation about Bill Pulte's relatives, but Trump himself. And this comes out today. What's your reaction to that investigation and how it may or may not come into play in the Lisa Cook case?
I think it's important investigative work because, there is this public narrative that, maybe this doesn't qualify as a reason, but, Donald Trump has identified something bad, that Governor Cook, and these other individuals like New York Attorney General Tish James have done. And the reality is, when ProPublica exposes the fact that basically every single cabinet official, not every single, but a lot of them, right, did something quite similar, this both strengthens the claim that Donald Trump is targeting, Tish James as well as Lisa Cook for pretextual reasons, right? It's not because they indicated on a mortgage document that this might have been a primary residence or whatnot. It's instead because, right, AG James, right, successfully litigated a case against the Trump organization. It's because Lisa Cook is a Black woman serving on the Federal Reserve Board, right, who was not inclined to just give Donald Trump whatever he wants as far as interest rates goes. And so this reporting, I think, strengthens the case that the firing of Cook, right, and the attempted prosecution, I guess right now, of New York Attorney General Tish James are pretextual.
Or, for example, the investigation of Senator Adam Schiff.
Yes, that too.
Thank you very much, Leah Litman, for breaking it all down. As you see right behind her on that bookshelf is a book that you ought to pick up and read, Lawless. It's about the Supreme Court. Can you say the full title for me?
Yeah, so the full title is Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. And just one quick note about the final chapter of the book, the case we've been talking about today, Trump versus Slaughter, about, whether the president can fire members of the FTC, is about the future of what's called the Unitary Executive Theory. And in the book, I write about how, as a young baby lawyer in the Reagan administration, John Roberts wrote a memo back in 1983 saying that the time was ripe to address the constitutional anomaly of independent agencies and to put them under presidential control. This has been a long-term project of the right-wing legal movement and the Republican appointees in particular. And so the seeds of this, right, have been dating back decades, and they are now finally in a position to do the thing, pull the trigger, overrule Humphrey's executor, as Project 2025 called on them to do, and as they have been angling to do now for, again, 40 plus years.
As a matter of fact, the unitary executive theory was referenced by name multiple times during this morning's arguments.
Yep.
So, folks, to really get the perspective about the things that are shaping the Supreme Court and how to understand this in macro of what is going on, pick up a copy of that book. If you've what you've tuned into this Substack Live a little late and you want to watch it a little later, you see that ticker on the top left corner of the Substack Live. That's where you can subscribe to All Rise News, where you can subscribe to Leah Litman's Substack, and this will go up on All Rise News later today. If you're watching this on YouTube later, take a moment to hit subscribe there. Thank you so much, Leah, and looking forward to talking again the next big argument or ruling.
There will be many occasions, unfortunately.
Thank you so much.
Take
Have a good
care.
day. You too.